Alina's neural implant chimed again, this time with a direct message from Coalition Command. Admiral Sorensen's weathered face appeared in her mind's eye, his expression grim. Reyes, we've got reports of Imperial boarding parties on the outer commercial docks. They're detaining Coalition citizens. This isn't just a show of force anymore. They're taking hostages. Alina clenched her jaw. Casualties. Minimal so far, but rising. The Nexus security force is standing down to prevent a massacre. The Admiral's image flickered as interference from Imperial jamming systems intensified. You need to understand your position, Ambassador. The Coalition Council is divided. Half want immediate military response, half are preparing surrender terms. Neither option ends well for us, Alina replied, watching another Imperial cruiser slide into position around Nexus. Its weapon ports glowed with barely contained energy, a deliberate intimidation tactic. Give me a chance to try something different. Admiral Sorensen looked skeptical. What can one diplomat do against an armada? History is filled with moments where a single conversation changed everything, Alina said. The Empire expects us to either attack or capitulate. They've prepared for both scenarios, but they haven't prepared for humanity. You have 12 hours before the Council votes on military intervention, Sorensen warned. Make them count. The transmission ended, leaving Alina alone with the weight of billions of lives on her shoulders. She turned to find Kex organizing her diplomatic credentials, his 4 arms moving with practiced efficiency despite his obvious anxiety. Ambassador, I've prepared the standard diplomatic package, Kex said, his voice pitched higher than normal. Formal protests, economic impact statements, appeals to Galactic Convention statutes. Alina shook her head. Put those away. We're not going to respond like they expect. But these are the approved protocols. Every diplomatic service in the galaxy uses these frameworks. And how well have they worked so far? Alina asked, moving to her personal console. She entered a series of commands, bypassing several security protocols. The Empire has spent centuries learning how to counter conventional diplomacy. They've cataloged every possible response and prepared countermoves. Kex's secondary eyes blinked rapidly, a sign of deep Centaurian distress. What are you doing? Accessing restricted cultural files, Alina replied, her fingers flying across the holographic interface, the kind that the xenoanthropologists deemed too sensitive for diplomatic use. The screen filled with data about imperial social structures, religious practices, and, most importantly, their complicated honor codes. Alina had spent years studying these files in secret, recognizing what her predecessors had missed. The Empire's species weren't just militarily powerful. They were bound together by intricate cultural frameworks that informed every decision they made. This is highly irregular, Kex protested, but he leaned forward with curiosity. Most of these files are classified as non-actionable intelligence. Alina smiled thinly. That's because no one thought to actually use them. The Empire doesn't respect strength alone. They respect those who understand strength's purpose. She pulled up detailed files on High Chancellor Kragath, studying his personal history. They're not mindless conquerors. They're believers in a specific vision of order. And to counter that, we need to speak their language, literally and figuratively. A proximity alert sounded throughout the observation deck. The Imperial shuttle was approaching to transport Alina to their flagship. She closed the files and straightened her diplomatic uniform, a simple navy blue outfit that contrasted sharply with the ornate regalia favored by other species representatives. Ambassador, I must advise caution, Kex said, handing her the official credentials. The Empire does not look kindly upon those who surprise them. Alina took a deep breath, mentally rehearsing the complex Voss greeting phrases she had memorized. Sometimes, Kex, surprise is the only advantage we have. She activated her emergency beacon, a last resort that would transmit her vital signs to Coalition Command. If I don't return, tell Admiral Sorensen to wait 24 hours before taking military action. No matter what happens. As they walked toward the docking bay, Alina felt a strange calm settle over her. Humans had been the newest addition to the galactic community, seen as diplomatic curiosities rather than serious players. Today, that perception would change forever. "Ready to make history?" she asked Kex. The Centaurian's 4 arms performed a gesture of nervous resignation. "I preferred making treaties, but history will have to do." The Imperial shuttle was a study in intimidation engineering. Unlike the practical, somewhat austere Coalition vessels, every surface gleamed with polished obsidian and crimson accents. Even the seating was designed to make non-Imperial species uncomfortable. Too high for some, too narrow for others. Alina noted how the Vosk pilot had smirked when she'd first attempted to secure herself in the ill-fitting restraints. "Protocol Mockingbird is extremely controversial," Kex whispered, his voice barely audible over the shuttle's engines. "The neuro-linguistic programming alone violates 3 different Coalition ethical guidelines." Alina adjusted her collar, where a small device hummed against her skin. "The guidelines have exceptions for diplomatic necessity. And right now, nothing is more necessary than speaking to the Empire in a way they'll actually hear." The Mockingbird Protocol was one of humanity's closely guarded secrets. Initially developed as a medical tool to help stroke patients recover language functions, it had been adapted by xenolinguists to allow humans to produce sounds physically impossible for human vocal anatomy. The device at Alina's throat would subtly manipulate her larynx and oral muscles, letting her articulate the complex clicks, subsonic rumbles, and dual-tone vocalizations of Imperial languages. What made it controversial wasn't the technology itself, but how it was perceived. Most species viewed language as an intrinsic marker of biological identity. To artificially reproduce another species' speech patterns was considered deeply transgressive, even offensive. "The Empire will see it as mockery," Kex warned. "Or respect," Alina countered, pulling out a small data crystal. "I need you to review something with me." She activated the crystal, projecting a holographic text between them. It contained details about High Chancellor Kragath that weren't in the official diplomatic briefing. His early military career, his family lineage, and most importantly, a little-known incident from his youth. 300 cycles ago, Kragath was a junior officer during the Outer Rim campaigns, Alina explained. His squad was ambushed by Meridian insurgents. Official records say he led a heroic last stand. Kex studied the text, but these personal journals from his squadmate tell a different story. Alina nodded. He didn't win through superior tactics. He won by learning enough of the Meridian dialect to convince them his squad had been infected with a biological agent. The Meridians retreated rather than risk contamination. He used deception instead of direct confrontation. Kex realized, his secondary eyes widening. That's considered dishonorable in Vosk culture. "But he was promoted anyway," Alina said, "because results matter more than methods, even to the Vosk." That contradiction is at the heart of Imperial culture. They preach honor but practice pragmatism. They worship strength but employ subtlety. The shuttle began its final approach to the Imperial flagship, the massive vessel growing larger in the viewport. Its hull was etched with the conquest history of 1,000 worlds, a museum of subjugation rendered in metallic relief. "Ambassador, what exactly is your strategy here?" Kex asked, genuine curiosity breaking through his professional reserve. Alina's eyes remained fixed on the approaching Leviathan. Imperial species all evolved as apex predators on their respective worlds. Their psychology is fundamentally different from Coalition species who mostly evolved as cooperative social groups. Meaning? They respect strength, yes, but they're also hardwired to recognize certain behaviors. Predators have innate responses when confronted with something unfamiliar. Alina smiled slightly. When a predator encounters something strange, it has 3 instinctive reactions: attack it, flee from it, or study it. "And you want them to study us," Kex concluded. "I want them to recognize they don't understand us," Alina corrected. "Apex predators are most dangerous when they're confident. I intend to introduce doubt." The shuttle docked with a metallic clang. As the airlock cycled, Alina performed a final check of the Mockingbird device. Everything she knew about the 7 Imperial species told her this approach was their best chance. Conventional diplomacy relied on finding common ground, but that assumed both parties wanted the same basic outcomes. The Empire didn't want peace. They wanted dominance with the appearance of peace. "One last thing," Alina said as the airlock doors began to open. "No matter what happens in there, remember that everything I do is calculated, even if it seems like I'm making a mistake." Kex nodded solemnly. "I hope you know what you're doing, Ambassador." "So do I," Alina whispered to herself. "So do I." Kragath's scales rippled with barely contained rage, a chromatic display that rippled from crimson to deep purple. The other Imperial representatives had gone utterly still, a reaction Alina had anticipated. In their evolutionary history, stillness preceded either retreat or attack. "You defile our sacred words," Kragath finally said, switching to trade standard. His translator rendered his voice flat, but the underlying harmonics conveyed his shock. "How dare a primitive species like yours attempt to?" Alina interrupted him by switching to formal Quarian, addressing the cybernetically enhanced representative directly. "Honored logic bearer Victor, your treatise on quantum encryption protocols saved coalition systems from collapse during the Cascade failure. My government acknowledges this debt." The Quarians' mechanical eyes whirred as they refocused. Unlike the Vosk, who valued tradition above all else, Quarians respected intellectual achievement, being acknowledged for his scientific contributions rather than his political position, visibly caught Victor off guard. Alina continued her calculated cultural offensive, addressing each Imperial representative in turn. To the telepathic Nair ambassador, she used the specific tonal patterns their species employed when sharing profound emotional truths. To the avian Krisk delegate, she performed the subtle wing echo gestures that indicated respect for an elder's territory. With each interaction, the atmosphere in the chamber shifted. Confusion replaced contempt. Curiosity undermined certainty. "Enough of these performances," Kragath declared, slamming his ceremonial staff against the floor again. "You mock us with stolen sounds and mimicked movements." Alina returned to trade standard, her voice clear and steady. "If I wished to mock you, Chancellor, I would mention the Meridian campaign." The effect was instantaneous. Kragath's primary scales flattened against his body, a Vosk reaction equivalent to a human's face paling. "You know nothing of my campaigns." "I know enough," Alina replied, her tone carefully modulated to convey respect rather than threat. "I know you used your enemy's language against them. You understood that true victory comes not from destroying your opponent, but from achieving your objective while preserving your strength." She took a calculated risk, stepping closer to the much larger Vosk. "You didn't defeat the Meridians with brute force. You outsmarted them. You used understanding as a weapon more effective than any disintegration cannon." For 13 seconds, Alina counted them silently. Kragath remained perfectly motionless. The other Imperial representatives watched their leader, waiting for his reaction. The coalition diplomats behind Alina held their breath. Then Kragath did something unexpected. He laughed. The sound was harsh and grating to human ears, but unmistakable. "Perhaps there is more to your species than we assumed," he said, his scales shifting to a more neutral blue-green. "You have studied us well." "While you've barely studied us at all," Alina replied. "That's your first mistake." Kragath's head tilted. "A predator's assessment. And our second. Assuming we think like you do." Alina gestured to the holographic display still showing the countless connections between their civilizations. "You value dominance. We value relationship." She let that sink in before continuing. "The Vosk evolved as solitary apex predators who came together only for strength. Humans evolved as weak pack animals who became apex predators because we cooperated. Our fundamental understanding of power is different." Alina could see the other Imperial representatives processing this information. The Nair delegates' tendrils writhed with interest, their species' indication of new neural pathways forming. Even the usually impassive Quarians seemed to be reassessing. You speak as if this philosophical difference matters more than our military reality, Kragath said, but his tone had shifted from dismissive to evaluative. It matters because it means your blockade will fail, Elena replied simply. You can physically control Nexus Station. You can never control the connections between our peoples, not without destroying the very things that make your empire prosperous. Kragath's inner eyelids flickered, a sign of intense thought, rarely displayed in public by Vosk leaders. You offer words when we demand action. I offer understanding when you demand submission, Elena countered. One of us will prove more effective. The silence that followed was different from before, not tense, but contemplative. Elena had achieved her first objective, disrupting the Empire's certainty. Kragath signaled to his aides, "We will consider your proposal. Return to your vessel until summoned." As Elena turned to leave, Kragath added something in untranslated Vosk, a phrase that made several Imperial representatives flinch in surprise. What did he say? Kex whispered once they were out of earshot. Elena's expression remained neutral, but her pulse quickened. He used the traditional address for an equal. Back in the temporary coalition quarters aboard Nexus Station, Elena reviewed the Imperial delegation's initial response to her proposal. As expected, they had rejected outright any suggestion of joint administration. Their counteroffer demanded coalition withdrawal from 3 key systems in exchange for Imperial protection of trade routes. They're asking for exactly what they wanted before our meeting, Kex observed, frustration evident in the rapid blinking of his secondary eyes. Your strategy has failed, Ambassador. On the contrary, Elena replied, studying the detailed terms. Look at Section 12, subsection Gamma. Kex scrolled through the document. It's just standard language about communication protocols between our governments, which has been expanded to include cultural and scientific exchange provisions, Elena pointed out. They've buried it in bureaucratic jargon, but they're offering something they've never offered before, formal recognition of non-military relationships between our peoples. She highlighted several other seemingly minor provisions scattered throughout the document. Each one represented a small concession, carefully disguised as administrative details. They can't appear to compromise, Elena explained, but they're testing whether we're paying attention to the substance rather than the form. Admiral Sorensen's holographic image appeared above the communication console. Ambassador, the Council is growing impatient. Your 12 hours are nearly up, and all I see is another Imperial demand for surrender. It's not surrender they're after anymore, Elena said. It's saving face. Give me 8 more hours. The Admiral's expression hardened. The Coalition Defense Fleet is already moving into position. If the Empire detects our military buildup, they'll consider it an act of war. Then they shouldn't have started this with an act of war of their own, Elena countered. But trust me, Admiral, a direct confrontation is exactly what they're prepared for. We need to continue on this path. After a tense silence, Sorensen nodded. 8 hours. Not 1 minute more. Once the transmission ended, Elena turned to her data terminal and began drafting a response to the Imperial proposal. What are you doing? Kex asked, peering over her shoulder. Accepting their terms, Elena said, with modifications. Kex's 4 arms gestured in alarm. You can't be serious. They're demanding territorials concessions that would cripple our position in the Antares sector. I'm accepting the communication protocols and cultural exchange provisions, Elena clarified, while rejecting the territorial demands. And I'm expanding Section 12 into a comprehensive framework for civilian interaction. She worked rapidly, transforming the buried concessions into the centerpiece of a new proposal. Where the Empire had offered limited scientific exchange, she proposed joint research institutes. Where they had suggested cultural visits, she outlined permanent cultural embassies on key worlds. They'll reject all of this, Kex predicted. They won't, Elena said with quiet confidence, because I'm giving Kragath exactly what he needs, a way to claim victory while actually compromising. She added one final provision: a joint humanitarian mission to assist worlds affected by the recent blockade, with equal representation from both powers. The Empire doesn't do humanitarian missions, Kex objected. They've never had a reason to before, Alina replied. Now they do. It's a way to demonstrate their power through generosity rather than force. When she finished, Alina encrypted the proposal and sent it directly to Kragath's personal channel, bypassing the usual diplomatic filters. Such a breach of protocol was risky, but it signaled the message's importance. What now? Kex asked. Alina checked the time. Now we wait for approximately 43 minutes. Why 43 minutes? Because that's how long it will take Kragath to read our proposal, recognize what I'm offering him, consult with his key advisors, and decide to respond personally rather than through intermediaries. Alina rose from her desk and moved to the viewport, watching the Imperial ships maintaining their blockade formation. The Vosk approach to negotiation is highly ritualized. Timing matters as much as content. And if you're wrong? Kex asked. Alina's reflection in the viewport showed no doubt. Then we've lost nothing except time we would have spent preparing for a war that's coming anyway. Exactly 42 minutes later, Alina's private communicator chimed with an incoming transmission from the Imperial flagship. Kex stared in amazement. How did you know? Alina allowed herself a small smile as she accepted the call. Because humans understand something the Empire has forgotten. The most powerful position in any negotiation isn't the one with the most weapons. The screen illuminated with Kragath's imposing visage. It's the one with the most accurate understanding of what the other side truly needs. Alina's broadcast continued to reverberate throughout Imperial space long after the transmission ended. Imperial sensors scrambled to contain its spread, but they faced an unexpected challenge. Citizens weren't sharing the entire speech, just small, seemingly innocuous clips that slipped through content filters. A Korean medical researcher forwarding Alina's mention of his life-saving work to colleagues. A Nair artist sharing her reference to an upcoming exhibition with her creative circle. A Vosk warrior explained to his squad mates how a human knew about their sacred traditions. Within hours, these fragments had spread across Imperial communication networks. By the time sensors identified one clip, 3 more had already gone viral in different sectors. The Empire's information control systems, designed to block revolutionary rhetoric or military secrets, proved completely ineffective against personal connections. On the Coalition diplomatic vessel, Alina monitored the impact through a secure intelligence feed. It's working even better than I expected, she told Kex, pointing to a heat map showing information spread across Imperial sectors. Their censorship algorithms are looking for Coalition propaganda, not personal messages. Kex studied the data with growing amazement. I've never seen anything penetrate Imperial information controls like this. But I don't understand. Why are citizens so interested in these snippets? There's no call to action, no political message. Because I didn't appeal to political ideologies, Alina explained. I appealed to something more fundamental, their sense of identity. Imperial citizens are taught from birth that they're superior to other species. Yet here I am, a supposedly inferior human, speaking their languages and acknowledging their individual achievements. She pulled up a series of message threads from an Imperial social platform. Look at the questions they're asking each other. How does she know about Professor Zanvex's research? Why would a human diplomat study our ancient poetry? If humans are as primitive as we're told, how can they understand our complex social structures? You've made them curious, Kex realized. Exactly. And curiosity is the natural enemy of authoritarian information control. Alina's eyes followed a particularly active thread discussing her use of Vosk high speech. Imperial citizens aren't questioning their government directly. That would trigger immediate censorship. They're questioning their assumptions about us. The ship's communication system chimed with an incoming message, an official protest from the Imperial Diplomatic Corps, demanding Elena cease all unauthorized communications with Imperial citizens. "They're rattled," Elena observed with satisfaction. "They can't accuse me of spreading falsehoods because everything I said was factually correct. They can't claim I revealed sensitive information because I only mentioned public achievements. Yet they know something dangerous is happening." A separate alert indicated an incoming message from Admiral Sorensen. His expression was grim when his holographic image appeared. "The Empire has formally declared you persona non grata, Ambassador. They're demanding your immediate removal from negotiations." Elena had expected this response. "Have they broken off talks entirely?" "No," Sorensen admitted, looking somewhat surprised himself. "They're demanding a different coalition representative, but they're still willing to continue discussions based on your last proposal." "That's our opening," Elena said. "Tell the Council to reject their demand to remove me, but offer to add 2 more senior ambassadors to our delegation. Frame it as elevating the importance of the negotiations, not as a concession." After Sorensen's image disappeared, Kex approached Elena with a data pad containing new intelligence. "You should see this. We're detecting unusual activity across multiple Imperial worlds." The pad displayed security footage from public spaces on Imperial core worlds. Small gatherings had formed in plazas and market squares. They weren't protests in the traditional sense. No signs, no chanting, no direct challenges to authority. Instead, citizens simply stood in groups, quietly discussing something on their personal devices. "They can't arrest people for having conversations," Elena said. "The Empire maintains the illusion of freedom for its citizens. Cracking down on people just talking would shatter that illusion." "This is unprecedented," Kex said, his voice hushed with wonder. "Imperial citizens never gather spontaneously. Their society is structured to discourage unauthorized assemblies." Elena watched as the footage showed an elderly Vosk approaching a group of younger citizens, asking to see what they were discussing. After viewing the screen, the elder joined the conversation instead of reporting it to authorities. "What happens next?" Kex asked. Elena's expression was a mixture of hope and determination. "Next, we make it impossible for the Empire to maintain both their blockade and their narrative." The Imperial response escalated beyond diplomatic channels. Within hours of issuing their ultimatum to the coalition, the Empire launched a massive information counteroffensive against Elena personally. Imperial news networks broadcast special reports detailing alleged human atrocities from Earth's history, carefully selected to paint humanity as dangerously primitive. Elena watched these broadcasts from the Coalition Command Center, her expression betraying nothing as the Imperial commentators described humans as barely civilized primates playing at diplomacy. "They're trying to discredit you specifically," Admiral Sorensen observed. "I've never seen the Empire focus so many resources on undermining a single diplomat." "It means they recognize the threat," Elena replied. "Not from me personally, but from what I represent, a different approach to power." The Imperial propaganda machine had centuries of experience crushing dissent. Their tactics were refined, effective, and ruthless. Alongside the public broadcasts, Imperial intelligence services began targeting the citizens who had shared Elena's message, making examples of the most visible ones. Several prominent academics who had commented favorably on Elena's cultural knowledge found their research funding suddenly revoked. Artists who had responded positively to her mentions of their work discovered their exhibition permits canceled. "This kind of internal crackdown usually works for them," Kex noted, reviewing the intelligence reports. "Fear is a powerful motivator." "Fear works when people feel isolated," Elena agreed, "but it becomes less effective when they realize others share their concerns." She activated a secure communication channel. Time to implement Operation Looking Glass. Within minutes of her authorization, Coalition intelligence officers activated dormant communication protocols throughout neutral systems bordering Imperial space. These weren't military channels, but civilian networks, entertainment streams, academic exchanges, commercial trading platforms. Each began broadcasting ordinary, everyday messages from Coalition citizens to their Imperial counterparts. The Centaurian merchant asking after an Imperial trading partner's family. A human scientist inquiring about a collaborative research project. A Tellurian artist sharing new work with an Imperial colleague. None mentioned the blockade or the diplomatic crisis directly. They simply acted as though the normal connections between civilizations continued uninterrupted, expressing concern for friends on the other side. The Empire can censor political messages, Elena explained to a puzzled Admiral Sorensen. They can block military communications, but they can't stop millions of personal connections without shutting down their entire communication network. What does this accomplish? The Admiral asked. It creates cognitive dissonance, Elena said. Imperial citizens are being told we're dangerous enemies preparing for war, while simultaneously receiving friendly messages from the very people they're supposed to fear. As predicted, the Empire began blocking these personal communications, an unprecedented restriction that affected millions of ordinary citizens who had no interest in politics but suddenly found their daily lives disrupted. A Quarian engineer couldn't access technical specifications from his coalition supplier. A Nair cultural attaché couldn't communicate with her artistic collaborators. A Vosk merchant found his supply chain communications severed. The effect rippled through Imperial society, transforming a distant diplomatic crisis into a personal inconvenience for ordinary citizens. It wasn't revolution. It was something the Empire was even less equipped to handle. Widespread, mild irritation. The Empire's leadership understands military threats, Elena told the Coalition Council during an emergency session. They know how to respond to economic sanctions, but they have no playbook for addressing millions of small frustrations that can't be blamed on enemy action, but stem from their own protective measures. As the ultimatum period reached its midpoint, Imperial internal security reports, secretly obtained by coalition intelligence, showed an unusual pattern. Requests for information about the coalition were increasing exponentially across Imperial space. Citizens weren't searching for military capabilities or political structures. They were looking up cultural information, language guides, and historical records. They want to understand us, Elena observed, not because they've suddenly become xenophiles, but because understanding reduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is what the Empire has accidentally created by overreacting. Kex, monitoring Imperial communication networks, suddenly straightened. Ambassador, I'm detecting unusual activity on restricted Imperial channels. Multiple high-level communications between core worlds. Something's happening. Elena's eyes narrowed as she studied the data. They're calling an emergency session of the Imperial High Command. All 7 ruling species representatives. Is that good or bad? Admiral Sorensen asked. Neither, Elena replied. It's inevitable. The Empire's leadership is discovering that controlling information is much harder than controlling territory. The formal announcement of the Coalition's Open Networks initiative sent shockwaves through the galactic diplomatic community. While the Empire had expected military mobilization or economic countermeasures, this unprecedented information offensive caught them completely off guard. Effective immediately, the Coalition President declared in a galaxy-wide broadcast, "We are removing all information barriers between Coalition and Imperial space. All our cultural, scientific, and educational databases are now freely available to anyone who wishes to access them, regardless of political affiliation." The announcement was deliberately timed to coincide with the academic cycle on key Imperial worlds, where students and researchers immediately flooded the newly accessible databases. Within hours, Coalition scientific journals that previously required expensive subscriptions and special permissions were being downloaded millions of times across Imperial space. The Empire's sensors are completely overwhelmed, Kex reported, monitoring the data traffic. They can't possibly review this much information quickly enough to block it. Elena nodded, watching the statistics climb on her display. And the more they try to restrict access, the more valuable the information becomes in the eyes of their citizens. The second phase of Elena's strategy, the Targeted Hospitality Program, launched 36 hours after the Open Networks initiative. The coalition announced expedited asylum and continued research opportunities for Imperial scientists, artists, and educators whose work had been disrupted by the crisis. "We are not asking anyone to defect or abandon their homeworlds," Alina clarified in her public statement. "We are simply offering temporary workspace and collaboration opportunities until normal relations resume." The wording was crucial: not political asylum, but professional courtesy; not defection, but scientific continuity. The offer framed the situation not as an ideological choice, but as a practical solution to a temporary problem. Admiral Sorensen remained skeptical. "You really think Imperial citizens will publicly accept coalition hospitality while their government is threatening us with war?" "Not many," Alina admitted. "But we don't need many. We just need enough high-profile individuals to create a precedent." Her prediction proved accurate when Professor Telix, the Empire's leading expert on subspace communications, publicly accepted a visiting researcher position at a coalition university. As one of the most respected Quarian scientists in Imperial space, his decision carried significant weight. "My research benefits all sentient life," Professor Telix stated. "Scientific progress cannot wait for political disputes to resolve themselves." Following his example, 16 other prominent Imperial researchers announced their intention to continue their work in coalition facilities. None made political statements or criticized the Empire directly. They simply framed their decisions as practical necessities for important work. The Empire faced an impossible choice. Preventing these scholars from leaving would require restricting their citizens' movements, a direct contradiction to Imperial propaganda about freedom and superiority. But allowing them to go would create a visible exodus of intellectual capital. "They'll try to discredit those who leave," Kex predicted. "They'll try," Alina agreed. "But it's difficult to discredit someone while simultaneously claiming they're too valuable to lose." The Empire's attempt to paint the departing scholars as traitors backfired spectacularly when families of patients who had benefited from Professor Telix's medical innovations began sharing their stories across Imperial networks. These weren't political statements, just personal testimonies about lives saved by his work and concerns about future patients if his research was interrupted. As the ultimatum deadline approached its final days, Alina embarked on her speaking tour of neutral systems. In each appearance, she scrupulously avoided criticizing Imperial leadership directly. Instead, she focused on the shared achievements of coalition and Imperial citizens working together through history. "The blockade of Nexus isn't just a coalition problem," she told audiences. "It's an Imperial problem too. It disrupts the natural connections between our peoples that have produced so much good throughout the galaxy." Her message was calculated to reach Imperial citizens without triggering censorship algorithms. It wasn't about politics, it was about relationships. Not ideology, but shared accomplishments. Not us versus them, but what we can achieve together. Meanwhile, the Imperial ultimatum clock continued ticking down, day by day, hour by hour. High Chancellor Krygath stood before the Imperial Assembly, his scales now a calm blue-green that indicated measured consideration, rather than the aggressive crimson he'd displayed days earlier. Behind him, holographic displays showed the Imperial warships disengaging from their blockade positions around Nexus. "Today marks a historic moment for our glorious empire," Krygath announced, his voice carrying to billions of citizens watching across Imperial space. "Having demonstrated our unquestionable military superiority, we now show our equal greatness through magnanimity." The carefully crafted speech presented the withdrawal as a sign of strength rather than concession. Imperial media dutifully broadcast images of cheering crowds across core worlds, celebrating what government commentators called a strategic repositioning. In reality, the Empire's internal situation had become untenable. The combined effects of Alina's initiatives had created unprecedented pressure from within Imperial society itself. Not through revolution or political dissent, which the Empire's security apparatus was designed to crush, but through millions of small, reasonable requests from ordinary citizens that collectively could not be satisfied while maintaining the blockade. Researchers needed access to coalition databases. Businesses required communication with coalition trading partners. Families wanted contact with relatives. Artists sought audiences. Students demanded educational materials. None of these requests were seditious. All were consistent with the Empire's own stated values of progress and prosperity. And in aggregate, they created a system-wide burden that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Aboard the Coalition flagship, Alina watched Krageth's speech with Kex and Admiral Sorensen. "He's selling it as a victory," Sorensen observed, his tone incredulous. "After everything, they're still claiming this was their plan all along." "Of course," Alina replied. "That's exactly what we wanted them to do. The Empire needs to save face, to maintain the illusion of control for their citizens and their own leadership." "But it's a lie," Sorensen protested. "It's diplomacy," Alina corrected. "The truth that matters is that the blockade ends, no territory changes hands, and no lives are lost in military conflict. How each side describes that outcome to their people is secondary." In the days following the blockade's end, the effects of Alina's approach continued to ripple through both societies. The connections between coalition and imperial citizens, temporarily severed and then restored, emerged stronger than before. The scholars who had accepted coalition hospitality returned to imperial space, with new collaborations already established. Students who had accessed coalition educational materials sought more information. "You've changed the relationship fundamentally," Coalition President Tarn told Alina during a private debriefing. "Not through treaties or threats, but through something more lasting. Humans have a long history of fighting ourselves," Alina explained. "We've learned painful lessons about how conflicts truly end. When one side is humiliated, resentment festers, and future conflict becomes inevitable. But when both sides can claim some form of success, lasting peace becomes possible." 1 month after the crisis, the Empire formally proposed new diplomatic protocols for future disputes, with the unprecedented stipulation that Ambassador Alina Reyes serve as the primary mediator. "They want you as the mediator?" President Tarn asked, stunned by the proposal. "The same person they declared persona non grata weeks ago. They respect what they almost failed to understand," Alina said. "The Empire values strength above all else. They just needed to recognize that strength comes in forms beyond military might." When Alina arrived at the newly designated neutral diplomatic station, she found High Chancellor Krageth waiting for her, without his usual entourage of advisors and guards. In person, without the ceremonial armor, he seemed both more imposing and somehow more vulnerable. "You have earned a place in imperial history, human," he said in Vosk high speech, dispensing with translators. "Few have ever challenged the Empire, and prevailed." "I didn't challenge the Empire," Alina replied in the same language. "I reminded it of connections it was overlooking." Krageth's scales shifted through several subtle color patterns, a Vosk expression of complex emotional processing rarely witnessed by outsiders. "Your species understands something we had forgotten," he finally said. "True power lies not just in what one can destroy, but in what one can preserve." As representatives from both powers gathered for the first session of the new Joint Diplomatic Council, Alina felt a sense of cautious optimism. The path ahead would not be easy. Centuries of tension couldn't be erased in weeks, but a foundation had been laid for something different. "You never expected to defeat them militarily," Kex said, now understanding the full scope of her strategy. "Humans learned long ago that military victories are often the most fleeting," Alina replied, watching former adversaries take their seats at the same table. "The most enduring triumphs aren't won through force, but through changing how others see themselves in relation to you." 3 years later, when the Void Swarm emerged from uncharted space, threatening all sentient life, that hard-won alliance would prove the salvation of the galaxy. But that, as they say, is another story.